Hello, and welcome to Meet the World European Writers 2021, an event put together by Unique London and the National Centre for Writing in Norwich, with support from the Polish Cultural Institute, the Embassy of Portugal, and the Embassy of Slovenia. My name is Erica Hesketh, and in my day job, I'm the Chief Executive of the Poetry Translation Centre in London. But today, I'm the happy interlocutor of these three wonderful novelists, Djaimilia Pereira de Almeida, Goran Vojnović, and Wioletta Greg, who I'm delighted to sort of meet through the magic of the internet. Let me introduce each of our speakers now. Djaimilia Pereira de Almeida was born in Angola and grew up in Lisbon. She has a PhD in literary theory from the University of Lisbon and is the multi-award-winning author of three books, Ajudar a Cair, Luanda Lisboa Paraíso, and Esse Cabelo, or That Hair, which is actually her debut novel and is her first book to be published in English, and the book we'll be delving into today. Hello, Djaimilia. Where are you speaking to us from, and what can you see from your window today?
Yes, so I'm speaking from, I live in a city that is south of Lisbon, the capital of Portugal. And on my window, I have a very gray sky today. So, yeah, but usually it is a very sunny city by the river. Yeah.
Thank you. It's really nice to meet you.
Yeah,
We
nice to
also have
meet you. It's an honor for me to be here with you.
author and director Goran Vojnović exploded onto the Slovenian literary scene in 2008 with his debut novel Southern Scum Go Home. The novel became an instant bestseller and gained notoriety after the police prosecuted Vojnović for defamation, and went on to gain him all the major national literary awards, including the Kresnik Award for Best Novel of the Year. His second novel, Yugoslavia, My Fatherland, and his third, The Fig Tree, which we'll be exploring today, also received the Kresnik Award, and in fact Goran is the only writer ever to receive this award for all of his novels. Yugoslavia, My Fatherland was made into a play, and it's been translated into 17 languages. Hello, Goran. Where are you speaking to us from, and what can you see?
Well, I'm here in Piran. This is a coastal city in Slovenia, a beautiful small city by the sea. Uh, Unfortunately, from my window, I don't see the sea, but I see the beautiful green hills, and I see some sun. So it's a little bit better than south of Lisbon. But yes, it's a very peaceful place, and I'm happy to be here after a few months because of the lockdown. Because otherwise, I live in Ljubljana, and we were not allowed to leave Ljubljana for a few months now. So yes, I think it's getting better every day.
I'm glad to hear that. Our last writer today is Wioletta Greg, who I've met before. How nice to see you again, Wioletta. Wioletta was born in a small village in the Jurassic Highland of Poland and lived for a time in Częstochowa and moved to the Isle of Wight in England in 2006, where she lived there for 10 years. She is the author of 8 volumes of poetry, as well as 2 novels, Swallowing Mercury, which was longlisted for the 2017 Man Booker International Prize, which I absolutely loved, and Accommodations, which is a loose sequel to that book, and we'll be talking about it today. Violetta's works have been translated into Catalan, Dutch, English, German, French, Italian, Spanish, and Welsh. Wioletta, hello. Where are you speaking to us from, and what can you see from your window today?
I'm speaking from England. I lived there from 2006 and I can see rain like in England and a garden. And I'm speaking from British refuge now because during pandemic time something happened. and I live now here. I'm living now here.
Whereabouts in England are you? Not on the Isle of Wight anymore?
No, I moved. I moved 1 year ago.
Well, we have a sunny day, a cloudy day, a rainy day, and here white sky in my in the front yard. But let's talk about your books now, the world of your books. We'll start with Violetta, if we may. Let's talk about Accommodations. It was translated into English by Jennifer Croft and published by Transit Books. The novel covers 3 years in the early adulthood of Viola, who we first met in Swallowing Mercury as a dreamy child growing up in the village of Hectare. When the novel opens, Viola is arriving in the big town of Czestochowa. Could you read us a little bit from the beginning of the book to give us a sense of it?
Yes, now, okay. I'm heading to Vega House in Częstochowa at the quarter before sunset. It is Friday, September 13th, 1994. Rain streaks across the bus windows. The dusk toys with the faces of passengers and make them into shapeless grey amoebas. When the driver turns the lights off, the crowd blurs together, looks like expiring mutation. Its bulky body heaves and swells and bursts into bundles of chiefs, deers, purslane poking out of people plastic bags. I'm nauseated by the odor of muesli ragged jacket, wool, the tonics with the women spits their hair. Sitting on my suitcase, I stare out the window where the sunlight disappears into poplars like when water closes over a cuttlefish. Suddenly, I think I see standing up near the front of the bus my old acquaintance, Camille, with whom I fell in love over the summer and then lost contact. That has to be him, I think, thrilled, squeezing myself and my suitcase towards him. It's really you? I ask, excited, grasping his leather jacket. Course, it's me, honey cake, responds the stranger as he eyes me up and down. Humiliated, I try withdraw, but the bus tilts over the roots in the road, and instead of taking a step backwards, I went up with my cheeks pressed against his hulking chest. The man, who is barely keeping himself upright because he drank, squints his left eye, reaches out for my breast, waving his hand around the air for a while, as though he were trying to pull back an invisible curtain, and then starts filling up the front pocket of my backpack where a beef stuffed roll has been festering since morning. Keep your hands to yourself, you filthy pervert, shouts one woman who has witnessed the whole scene. At the word pervert, the crowd disperses. The bus stops in the city outskirts, and I get off like a fish leaping free from aquarium, clinging on the shelter at the stop. I greedily suck down gulp after gulp of fresh air.
That's so beautiful. Thank you.
Thank you.
Can you
This was my first reading in English, and sorry, maybe.
No, it was gorgeous. Thank you. Could you speak to
Thank
us a
you.
little bit about the relationship between Violetta, you, and Viola, your character? Where does one end and the other begin?
Um, Yesterday, I read some interesting novel of Vivian Gornick. This is American writer, and she taught something interesting. I became a writer when I started being a mythomaniac, and when I was writing my book Accommodation, I used my diary, I used my notes, but Viola, it's not me. This is my imagination. This is my alter ego, and the books was fiction, but I was living in convert as a student. These were my adventures, my experience, but Viola is not me.
There's a lot of things that happen to Viola in this book. I don't want to give anything away for the people watching, but the accommodations that she inhabits are really different from each other. So that first place she lives, the Vega, is very masculine, intense, unpredictable place. And then later the convent, the Congregation of the Sister of Christ's Heart, is very feminine, light, cloistered place. But there is a sort of violence in each of these settings. And I was interested to know what you were exploring in each of these places for Viola.
Yes, I'm in every my books. I'm interested in theory of French philosopher Michel Foucault, and he wrote about heterotopias. Heterotopia is other word for different word, sometimes hiding word, and I try find some places for my characters, but and to describe it, but in every places, other places like convert, like hotel with immigrants, there are dangers for my protagonist, because the system is dangerous for women. This is a patriarchy system, and I explore. For example, in my first scene of my book, Viola is came to the city from small village, and because she would like study literature, and she's abused in the bus, and this was my idea: show other words like convert with nuns, hotel with immigrants, and how the girls try survive there.
Yeah. The backdrop to the novel as well is very interesting because there's a changing Poland going on in the background of Viola's journey, and it's a Poland that is after the fall of communism, and there's all around the city of Częstochowa, there's these signs of capitalism everywhere. And also, at one point, Viola is working in a McDonald's. And I wondered what impression you wanted readers to have of this period of Polish history. Is it meaningful for you that she is going through this development into an adult at the same time as Poland is, quote unquote, developing into capitalism? Was that part of what you intended with this book?
Yes, because I was witness of a collapse of communism, in Poland. I described from woman perspective changes in Poland and what's how country was changed in this time. But interest for me was important to show how young woman, girls 18 girl see can see this world, how he remember communists as well, and what's happened this time.
I think it's interesting that all three of your books, in a way, are examining political and social history through a very personal lens. And I guess maybe also the social and political history is informing the personal narrative as well. There's a two-way relationship. Djaimilia, let's talk a bit about That Hair, which was translated by Eric M.B. Becker and published by Tin House. Your book also really is an exploration of gender as well, but also race, the legacy of colonialism, family history, all through the prism of Mila's fabulous, unruly hair. The idea of using hair to explore Black diaspora experience is, in a way, tried and tested in fiction. What inspired you to take this approach for Mila's story?
Yes, I think that I wanted to try to use hair as a projection of the self, in a way, of this little girl's self. So I see hair in the book. I don't think the book is a book about hair. I take the hair or the motive of hair in the book as a projective thread by which the book is the story is told. I wanted to address on the first time I started to think about what became this book. I wanted to address a particular form of a particular form of sensibility of a young woman's sensibility, and a sort of I wanted to try to put in words a form of feminine sensibility, which wasn't very familiar in Portuguese literature, and surely not familiar regarding Black characters, and much less Black women characters. So I wanted to make this Mila think about herself, and to try to find a place for a girl like her to think about herself, something like that.
Yeah, it is interesting that the hair, as you say, isn't the main character of the novel, but it's almost like the concept of hair is placed against lots of different settings and other ideas, and the Mila as a narrator is in the story, but she's also kind of writing an essay on herself. There's a real investigation of the self happening in this book, with hair as the kind of thesis title or something. I found that so fascinating. So for the people watching at home, the novel follows Mila through her childhood and adolescence, from the sort of mid 80s to about the 2010s. And at one point, Mila is running around Lisbon with her cousins in the 90s. And I thought this was so beautifully described. And the existence of these kind of wild children is so different from that of the Lisboetas who, as you say, drink cherry liqueur and pose with Pessoa. And Mila asks, are we invisible or are they? Which I thought was such a wonderful line. And I read it to mean, whose story is this? Whose history is this? And you were saying that the kind of tropes and ideas that you were talking about aren't very common in Portuguese literature. When you write, are you writing? Who are you writing for?
Yeah. I think I'm at least I aim to write to everybody, so I don't have a particular kind of reader on my mind, but and I have no particular intention of representing any kind of minority or something like that, or marginal point of view. I don't have that intention at all. But it is a fact that in many of my books, I tend to, my characters tend to be people who walked through the city unnoticed. So I tend to look at these people and I tend to make them central to my books. But I don't know, maybe what I would like is to make a room for characters like Mila, and I'm thinking about other characters from other books. Make a room for them to make them come into existence in Portuguese literature, if you may. Yeah.
I there's such a lot going on there. I was really taken by a lot of the subtle way you talk about the quote unquote immigrant experience in Portugal and the sort of different levels of that. And there's this amazing line when you're talking about when Mila's talking about her grandfather Castro, and his experience of being kind of other, and the line, fear of being mistaken for a madman is nevertheless a sign of not feeling at home. That kind of idea of being permitted to be truly yourself when you're from somewhere else. And we have an idea here in the UK, the good immigrant, which captures some similar ideas. How far do you think things have or haven't changed for communities of colour in Portugal since the 1980s, when a lot of this novel was
Yeah.
set?
Yeah. Before I answer that, I will just look at the question just to say that what I find inspiring and interesting in this kind of idea that you need to feel at home to be yourself. Is that and I think this about other kinds of emotions that I treat in the book. What I am aiming at is is something that is not exclusive to this this to characters like Mila or like Mila's grandfather. So what captivates me in them is what they have in common with other persons who doesn't have similar experiences through immigration or something. So my interest is in what they have in common with everybody else. So that's the meaning of saying that I try to write about them to everybody else, including people who are not immigrants and who doesn't have an unruly hair or something like that. But to answer the question, I think a lot has changed since Mila's grandfather arrived in Portugal back in the 80s, and there are many things to accomplish yet, but for that generation or for that generation grandchildren and maybe grandchildren, you can see that they have they experience less difficulties in terms of access to education and the expectation of some share of equality in Portuguese society. And at the same time, there are still many problems and problems that now are more spoken about and which were silent back in the 80s. I think that today this at this point in 2021 we are as a community in Portugal addressing things like in many other places in Europe and in the world. So there are a public debate around themes like racism and systemic racism and things like that that weren't present at all back in the 80s. But I think it's a journey. As a Portuguese citizen, I think that things are looking brighter and things are more talked about, but there are many things still to accomplish. Yes.
That sounds familiar.
Yeah.
Goran, I'd like to bring you in here actually, because I know in your books you've addressed ethnic tensions within Slovenia, particularly racism towards minority communities from former Yugoslav republics. One of the features of the fig tree is, and it was dealt with really cleverly by your translator Olivia Hellawell, is the use of different languages from the former republic within the narrative. And I found the way that different characters in the story, like Alexander, Inyana, and Safet and Dane, are kind of separated by walls of language at various points in the story, really very beautiful and deft and also heartbreaking. And obviously Southern Scum Go Home was quite famous for mixing together lots of different languages on the page. And so I wondered if you could speak to us about the way in which you use language and some of the politics of that.
Yes, so I am bilingual. I grew up in two languages, actually. At home, we spoke the language that was then called Serbo-Croatian, but has since separated into four different languages: Croatian, Bosnian, Serbian, Montenegrin, which are more like a dialects of the same languages, but politically divided. And of course, I lived in Slovenia. I learned Slovenian as a child in a kindergarten, and I grew up to write in both of those languages. But soon I discovered that I'm much more much more articulated in the Slovenian language, since I finished my school in Slovenian, and the Slovenian was the language I used in different occasions, not just in family. So my mother is actually a sort of kitchen language, which we used about food and going from home, and we always mixed it with a lot of Slovenian. So when I started to write, was obvious to me that I was going to write in Slovenian, but somehow my Slovenian was always mixed with my mother tongue. And my first book was actually written in a dialect which we spoke in the neighborhood, which was, of course, a mixture of all the languages. And I probably would never become a writer. I was studying film directing, but I would never become a writer if I didn't have this idea that this language should be written down, because it was so interesting, it was so funny, and it was in a way disappearing. Later on, of course, I didn't write in this kind of language, but still my Slovenian was always, in my Slovenian language, there was always present my other language, or through the dialects, through some words. And I took the opportunity, because these two languages aren't so different from each other, and a lot of Slovenians at least understands, if not speaks, this Serbo-Croatian language. So I started using it very freely. Like in film, when you have a Bosnian character, he speaks Bosnian, and that's how I went with my books. Also in the Fig Tree, when you have a Bosnian character, he speaks in Bosnian. Of course, you cannot translate that in English in two different languages, but I think Olivia is a translator and left a couple words or sentences so you can get an idea of it. But yes, it's when you live in this in two languages, then you start being very interested in how the language works, how this mixture of languages work, all the barriers for me as a speaker of, let's say, Serbo-Croatian, how society treats other languages, how people who speak different languages speak to each other, to their kids. So it's open so many subjects, and of course, you're as a writer, you can't just write a story. It's always the story about a language as well. So no matter what I write, there is always question. Okay, how do these characters speak? Which language they use in different occasions? So I have a lot of bilingual characters, and sometimes all the way they choose which language they will speak to somebody reveals so much about themselves. So yeah, it's a very important tool, I would say, for me as a writer.
That's fascinating, that the material you're using to make the story is itself loaded with meaning, and that it's impossible for that not to have meaning. My family speaks Japanese, and it's a language full of registers, many registers, and the use of register. If you read a novel, the way in which a character speaks, the type of Japanese they choose to speak, says so much about their status, their relationships, the power dynamics, everything. It's interesting to me that when you write in Slovenian, that's going on in the material of the language as well. I've got to say, though, the novel isn't just an exercise in languages. It's a incredibly immersive, wonderful, multi-generation saga that you just bask in. It's wonderful. For the people watching us from home, the story follows the narrator Jadran, who is tracing back the stories of his family members to, I guess, better understand himself and his place in the world, if that's the super small nutshell version of the story. It has been beautifully translated, and the publisher was Istros Books. The plot is important, or the way in which the stories unfold is important. So I don't want to give things away, but there is a lot of leaving. Like quite a few characters leave or run away, and I wondered if you could talk to us a bit about this theme.
Where the main idea of the book was about a man who just ends his life and just goes somewhere. In my mind, he was in some tropical part of the world where nobody recognized him. He just cut all the ties. And I was wondering about this man, who he is and how close he is to me and my own desires, because I think every person has this desire, stronger or less stronger, to just end all of his affairs and to be free. So I just wanted to explore how are we balancing this desires to be free with all the needs we have for ties, to be bonded with people, to have all this relationship we have, and how do we manage with all of these in this modern world, which rates freedom, personal freedom, very highly, and talks about a freedom like a fundamental value, and somehow it's like wanting us to do this, to leave, to run away. And of course that was the main idea, but then all the other ideas came along, and so basically it ended up as a book, I think, about also how different times, different periods of history are actually, how big role do they play in our lives, in the lives of the characters, in their decisions. So how much they encourage this leaving or how much they stop it in a way. So you have the 3 different love stories, and all in 3 different time periods, and of course time and history always play a role, but always different. So also these characters are their decisions are different. So but yes, the main idea of the book was actually to really explore this desire and our as of freedom opposite to love and connection and relations, and all the emotions that go, complex emotions that goes with it.
Yeah. So one of the love stories or relationships in the novel is between Alexander and Jana, who are Jadran's grandparents. And Alexander is one of the people who goes and comes back. And I wish we had time to talk about all the different characters' journeys, but I found both of those characters fascinating. When he comes back, the entire structure of their relationship changes, and I think you've got a reading for us where he is reflecting on that. Would you share that with us now?
Okay. The next evening he returned to the fig tree. He sat beneath it and waited for Vesna to call and tell him about Safet's disappearance, to ask him if she could speak to her mom. He held the receiver in his hand and explained to her that her mom wasn't well, and that he knew this news would crush her. He was looking at Jana and was looking at Vesna too. He could see both of them now, and he saw Safet too, eavesdropping on his conversation from some muddy bunker. He was the only one that lived with her, he told them. He was the only one who had witnessed her departure, the only one who had been by her side as her words ceased to come together as thoughts, when words lost their meaning, the only one who flushed the toilet after her 3 times a day, the only one who chased after her into the garden to put a coat on her when she left the house barefoot in the middle of the winter. He was the only one who had to tell her every morning that it was Alexander, her husband, the only one who had to understand that she didn't like to share a bed with a stranger, the only one who helped her find the toilet in the middle of the night, the only one to be the stranger in the night who caused her to back away in fear, the only one who had to convince her that he'd seen her naked body before and then there was no one else to call except him, the only one. Evening after evening he would return beneath the fig tree and retell his story. He sat down under the tree, leaned against it like a tired, hounded animal that eventually gives in and surrenders to its prey. He let all of their resentments ensnare him, let them feast on him like bloodthirsty animals, gnawing at his old bones. From beneath the tree he would sometimes see the splendor of the landscape. He looked out towards the sea and wondered how much of the gulf was still his. As he looked beyond the house, northward, he sensed a presence in the distance halting his gaze and explaining that he could look no further, that he was only permitted to look as far as the large trees at the top of the hill. He had to secretly smuggle glances and his yearning across newly drawn borders, borders which he himself would never cross. He sat beneath the fig tree and saw her trembling, viney hands cautiously feeling at the door handle as if they had never opened it before. He saw her eyes, wide open, scanning the wall in search of a towel. He saw her tilt her head back and stare up at the spotted pattern of the ceiling, as if it hadn't already been there for years, drawn by the damp. He saw her studying him, surprised, scouring his face for a clue that might reveal him to her.
Thank you. Yeah, this is. I don't know. I don't want to give anything away for the story, but in this part of the story, Jana's memory is fading, and there's there's beautiful descriptions of the objects in their home or the objects in their lives disappearing when she can no longer remember them, the first car they drove, or the cat they used to see. And when the object disappears, that part of history has gone, and that the way in which memory and language work together in that is just gorgeous. There's a line in I think in this section as well, or maybe soon after, where you say the world was just a view through their window. And I love that line because it's doing so much work talking about how the world of Alexander and Jana has shrunk right down to their little house on the border. It's just on the Croatian side of the border. But as you say, it's in a time when borders are shifting around, but there's a lot happening outside. And I just wondered if you could say a little bit more about juxtaposing, their private drama with the sort of huge history that's happening outside. This is in the period you're talking about. This is the 90s with the Balkan Wars and such a lot of suffering. What is that juxtaposition for you?
Well, for me personally, we weren't able to, my family at least, weren't able to just close themselves into our house and see the world just as a view from the window. We were much more involved, and in a way, this war and separation of Yugoslavia was one of the things that left a very huge trace on the way I understand the world and basically who I am. But I always knew that a lot of people were able, especially in those parts, that weren't so much affected by the world. They were not just able, but always they were forced to just close themselves in because they had some other problems, and they just couldn't deal with everything that was going on. It was much easier for them because it was heartbreaking. The world was disappearing, and a lot of people just couldn't really deal with it at the moment. Of course, if you lived in Bosnia or in parts of Croatia where the war was raging, uh, you weren't that lucky. But at the same time, a lot of people just clothed themselves in, and after the war, and this is also what I deal with the book. There was a lot of anger and disappointments from the people who are real victims of the war, centered towards those who, in a way, was able to escape these atrocities. And there is still, I think, in our societies a huge misunderstanding between people who suffered differently during the war. In a way, all of the people suffered, but of course, a lot of people lost the dear ones. A lot of people were wounded. A lot of people were basically lost. They lost everything they had, and then there were the lucky ones who somehow managed to get by. And Alexander and Jana are those who, two of them were able to just close out of everything that was going on. But Alexander, their daughter Vesna, in a way lost her husband, and that's why relations never repaired afterwards. There was a huge pain on Vesna's side because of this loss and because of Alexander's reluctance to help her deal with this loss. So yeah, I want this is something that very much interests me, because in a way, me living in Slovenia, I was the one who couldn't really escape war, while a lot of my friends, Slovenians, they lived normally, and I needed years and years to not blame them for it, to understand that they had all the right to live on and not being bothered by this close but distant war. And I needed a lot of time in writing, I think, to really get to the point where I just say, I'm happy for them to be as lucky as they were, not to be involved in this horror stuff. And I must say, for me, that I was lucky enough that I didn't lost anyone, that all my relatives came out of the war alive. But this is a process. This is a huge, long process.
It's really so interesting to me that so many of the characters, so many of the family members of Jadran are furious a lot of the time. They seem to just really be angry, and there's long sort of bravura sections where they just rage about the things that have made them feel that they feel as unfair, or things that have hurt them, or the things that they can't forgive. And Djaimilia, will you read to us a little bit from that hair?
Yes. So I'm going to read from chapter 8. In a book, I come across images of ruins. I live through the sequence. I experience it as a family photo album. Castles, control towers, prisons, aqueducts, abandoned pools. Us in our childhood photo albums. What's common to the images is not the way they reflect a collective tradition of neglect, but the way that surviving monuments present themselves as living pairs belonging to a single familiar pathway. Such are my feelings for each one that flashes before me. In a single city, there is no room for more than one water park in ruins. In one image, a field has overtaken the ruins of a castle. In another, a slide empties out into what was once a community pool. What would would that we could find new uses for the equipment of the past, turn a cane devoured by woodworms into a flute or a Baroque style handrail, rediscover familiar traditions in the effects of time and nature, conflate neglect with artistic intent. Such is the entire contents of what remains of what is gone, is not the places we formerly inhabit and that today I found abandoned, that assumed the status of ruins. It is we who, though we've not been abandoned, survive like the only castle in a miles wide radius, a sign that life once existed, where today there's only dead grass, olive trees, and cork oaks. My damaged childhood photos, crammed into an old shoebox to slowly lose their color, in some cases gluing to one another, do not owe their survival to the cure of some documentarian. We cannot dispense with the rediscovery of ourselves as the product of the records that our neglect has relegated to a drawer, exactly as if we'd come to the realization that the purpose of the cure, of the restorer's zeal, was not that of zealously caring for the recorded materials themselves, but for all that reaches us from what we have documented, as if the cure could cure the individuals registered there and not the medium through which they live on. We cannot deny that our childhood has changed color and that is coloring now, and that its coloring now is not the sepia occasioned by the photograph, but the sepia of our neglect.
Thank you so much. There's a lot there which beautifully captures something the novel explores about the reality of things, our perception of things, the memory we overlay on that reality, the act of remembering being a new kind of perception, which is a sort of identifying, and the ways in which those bounce back and forth, and without landing on anything. I think that's something really special about your book, is that it leaves open so many possibilities of approach, that there's an ambiguity which Mila as the narrator, and I guess you as the author, are embracing. There's these two propositions, I guess, about questing for the self, which seem to be in conversation with each other through this book. At one point, Mila says, finding someone may be a sign that you were looking for them. But then later on, or another time, she says, a person only finds herself by chance. That the reality is what you discover just along the way of doing something else. And you wrote both of those lines. Where do you where do you sit on this? Is it worth trying to pin ourselves down? Is it possible, or is the act of
Yeah.
it the point in a way?
Yes, I think that two lines exemplify some of the process, the writing process behind the book, because in some way. In some way, I didn't know what I was going to find when I started to write, and I discovered Mila and discovered the book. I don't mean by chance, because I was looking for something, but I didn't know what the end would be like. I was the the text was being revealed as a kind of a walk through the woods or something. A walk. What I mean is that I don't. I think that the process of writing this book is similar to, in a way, the way life is. In a sense, you don't know what you're gonna find. I'm here talking to you right now, and I don't know what I will do next, what will happen next. And what I find interesting in writing, among many other things, is it's the kind of surprise that is implied in the process. A surprise and a sort of puzzlement that is that is in the process. So I don't know what I'm going to find, and I think that in Mila, in her journey or in her quest, she is also very much surprised by her discoveries. She the, and as you said, the book doesn't find any kind of answer. She's not looking for any answers. She's posing questions, and many times she's trying to. I don't know if she's trying, but at least she lives well with contradictions and with opposites.
Yeah, and that is quite unusual in a novel, I think, to to hold that space open for the ambiguity, and also to create an experience for the reader that the story or the intellectual exploration is literally happening as you read it. It's a really very interesting experience as a reader. And I think it takes quite a lot of skill to create that on the page. It isn't just like walking through a woods. But I was really fascinated as well that Mila, in trying to put all these questions around herself or look at the people and scenarios of her life from different angles, it keeps herself at a bit of a distance. I think she says at one point about standing on formality with yourself. And she seems to really want a genuine experience of self, but doesn't quite have it, or keeps second guessing her ability to have it. Why is it that Mila finds it so hard to embody herself? And can you speak a bit about the stock black woman who she sort of grapples with?
I wasn't sure what was the Portuguese for this top black woman, but yeah, this happens sometimes to me, that the translation, if you just extract a passage or some line, but at least what I think is that Mila has a lot of what I like in books and in thinking, and a lot of maybe a lot of my way of thinking too, because you asked me why is it so hard for Mila to embody herself, and I think my answer would be, isn't it hard for everybody? So I find it, I don't think that to embody yourself is, is a very simple thing, or a thing that comes easily. And she has this particular thing in her life, and the book is all written around that thing. She's a person that in some way doesn't belong really anywhere. She is not entirely Angolan, and she's not entirely Portuguese. She has um, she is not at home with her own body, at least fully. Um, so there's a lot of things blocking this embodiment. So there's a lot of things in her that block her her embodiment. So I think that's it. But she lives in a kind of a limbo. I don't know. Do you have this word in English? A limbo.
Yep.
Yeah, she lives in a limbo as a citizen, and in a political sense, and in the geopolitical sense, she lives in a limbo. But this limbo is not only a geographical, political limbo, but it's also an interior limbo. So she has internalized this conflict between nations and between nationalities that that she was born to, and she has internalized this conflict in a way that her own self is in conflict. So her own self is in a limbo. She's not white, she's not black, she's not Portuguese, she's not Angolan. That's a lot of things to
Juggle.
yes.
Yeah, and I think you're right. It was an unfair question because it is hard to embody yourself. But it struck me that Mila considers each of her four grandparents who are so key to the story as all somehow being almost like archetypes, but also inhabiting those really naturally. Like she observes them doing that naturally, which I thought was really fascinating for Mila to be watching and seeing that, and in a way thinking that I can never do that. We've spent so long talking, and I'm realizing that time is short, but I wanted to ask about the translations, because of course all of your books are available to the likes of me because they've been translated into English. Goran, your translator Olivia writes in her translator's note in The Fig Tree that the two of you attended the British Centre for Literary Translation in Norwich in 2019 to workshop some of the sections of the book, and she said that the translations made by the group actually made it into the final book, which I thought was such a lovely thing. Can you talk to us about being translated, and particularly being translated by a group?
Yes, it was a first time experience for me, and it was really a wonderful one. There was, I think, 7 students with really different experience, different backgrounds. There were native speakers of Slovenian, there were Spanish speakers, English speakers, very different group. And I knew that translation is, in a way, the process of rewriting a book. But being there, I was able to see how, like writer, also translator has numerous possibilities how to write every sentence. It was so many different ideas how to translate a simple sentence that I was thinking, well, this is so simple. Why should we complicate it? But then everyone started to bring in their own ideas, and it suddenly was really interesting process for me because it was such a similar to the writing process, and it was so much fun. Yes, and it was so creative also, and of course I think Olivia didn't have a chance not to use that translation we did. It's basically we were there for a week, but ended translating one page of the novel because we talk so much about a background on each sentence and word and expression, and it was really rewarding for a writer to be present when something like this happens, and I think everybody had a lovely time, and I could see how much problems I make with my writing for the translators. And I already felt sorry for them before, but now I'm even more, I have a more uh, um, as a guilty conscience when it comes to translators.
Oh, I wouldn't feel guilty. I think from my experience of translators, the trickier the puzzle, the more pleasure there is in tackling it. So something like your multilingual book, with also the way in which you had inner and external dialogue represented differently, all of that on the page would have been so much fun to dive into. As a pretty fluent English speaker yourself, were you involved with, like, did you chip in with ideas, or were you mostly observing or just clarifying?
Well, I couldn't help myself to help here and there, but yes, I'm not so good in English as those guys were. So yeah, I was mostly observing. Only here now I would ask, what about this or that? Um, just to join the party, I think, more than to give some great idea, because it seemed to me they're having so much fun, and nice. But yes, I think at the end of the day, I had to admit it was a lot of fun, but I wouldn't be translator if I would have to choose. I sometimes do translate myself from one of my languages to the other, and I must say I'm not very good at it. It's that's why I have this feeling that translators are having huge problems when translating, but mostly that's just me, not the real translators.
Djaimilia, what was it like for you? This is your first book being translated into English, wasn't it? What was the experience like working with Eric?
Oh, it was perfect. It was in the States, and I was here in Portugal, and we just spoke on the phone and exchanged uh, um, dozens of emails, and he would ask me whenever he has some doubt. But it was a very peaceful time because we had plenty of time to do the translation. So at some point he just was very on the work alone by himself. So at some point I stopped being asked to answer questions, but in the end we had a lot of conversations about the translation. I'm very happy. Yeah, it was great. But it was a very it was a distant process because he was in the States and I was here in Portugal.
Thank you so much to all three of you for your time and your wisdom. It's been really a pleasure to discuss your work with you, and I hope you at home have enjoyed it as well. My thanks go to Wioletta Greg, Djaimilia Pereira de Almeida, and Goran Vojnović, and Unique London, the National Centre for Writing, the Embassy of Slovenia, the Embassy of Portugal, and the Polish Cultural Institute. Next time we meet, I hope it could be in person. In the meantime, please do stay safe and visit your local bookshop to buy a copy of these wonderful books. I thoroughly recommend them. And thank you very much for being here. Bye-bye.
Bye bye.
Bye-bye.